In March of 2019, contractors renovating a century-old farmhouse in rural Lancaster County made a discovery that would chill investigators to their core. Beneath rotting floorboards in what appeared to be a servant's quarters, they found 17 leather-bound journals, their pages yellowed with age and desperation. The entries, written in multiple hands across several decades, told the same horrifying story again and again. They will not let us leave. God help us. They will never let us leave. If you're ready to uncover this buried truth, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Each journal belonged to a different person. Different handwriting, different years, different backgrounds, but every single entry shared the same terrifying reality. These were the desperate pleas of outsiders who had stumbled into an Amish settlement in 1892 Pennsylvania, only to discover that the community's famous hospitality came with an unthinkable price. Picture Pennsylvania in the final decade of the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution was transforming cities like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh into smoking monuments to American progress, but vast stretches of the state remained untouched by modernity. In these remote valleys, isolated communities could exist for decades without meaningful contact with the outside world. The Amish settlements of Lancaster County were particularly insular. These descendants of German Swiss Anabaptists had fled religious persecution in Europe, seeking the freedom to practice their faith without interference. They spoke Pennsylvania Dutch among themselves, kept to their own customs, and viewed the English, their term for all non-Amish, with deep suspicion. But suspicion can curdle into something far more sinister. In 1892, communication was primitive. No telephones connected remote farmhouses to county seats. Mail delivery was sporadic at best. When someone disappeared while traveling the lonely roads between towns, families might wait months before concluding their loved one was truly missing. And even then, what could they do? The assumption was always the same. The missing person had simply decided to start fresh somewhere else. After all, this was America. People disappeared into the wilderness all the time, chasing dreams of gold in California or free land in the territories. This isolation created perfect conditions for communities to operate entirely outside the law. And in one particular settlement, it created something far worse. Friedenshof sat in a valley so remote that even today, GPS struggles to locate it precisely. The settlement consisted of perhaps 24 families, all bound together by blood, marriage, and an increasingly twisted interpretation of their faith. At its center stood the farmhouse of Elder Jakob Zimmermann, a man whose interpretation of Scripture would make the devil himself recoil. Zimmermann was not your typical Amish elder. Born in Switzerland, he had fled not just religious persecution, but criminal charges related to the mysterious deaths of several members of his original congregation. In Pennsylvania, he found fertile ground for his particular brand of theological extremism. He preached that God's providence was absolute, that every stranger who wandered into their valley had been sent by divine will for a specific purpose. That purpose, according to Zimmermann, was salvation through submission. The settlement appeared, at first glance, to embody every romantic notion Americans held about Amish life. Neat farmhouses with carefully tended gardens, barns raised through communal effort, children playing in spotless clothing while their parents worked the fertile soil with their hands and simple tools. Visitors who stumbled upon Friedenshof in its early years often commented on the unusual warmth of the welcome they received. Perhaps they should have wondered why that warmth felt so desperate. The community had developed elaborate protocols for dealing with outsiders. When travelers appeared, lost salesmen, injured wanderers, families whose wagons had broken down, they were immediately surrounded by helpful hands. Food was pressed upon them. Their injuries were tended. Their needs were anticipated before they could even voice them. But something was wrong with this picture of pastoral perfection, something that visitors might not notice until it was far too late. The journals found beneath those floorboards tell us that the first signs of wrongness were always subtle. A traveling salesman named Edgar Hartwell, whose journal entries begin in September 1892, initially wrote with gratitude about the community's kindness. He had injured his leg when his horse threw him on the treacherous mountain road, and the Amish families had taken him in without hesitation. They have been most generous, Hartwell wrote in his careful script. My leg mends well under their care, and they refuse all payment. Elder Zimmermann speaks of God's providence in bringing me to their valley. I confess, after the harsh treatment I've received in other towns, their Christian charity moves me deeply. But by his fifth entry, dated 2 weeks later, a different tone creeps into Hartwell's writing. I express my desire to continue my journey today, as my leg has healed sufficiently. Elder Zimmermann became most stern, insisting that God's will is not yet complete. He says I have been brought here for instruction in the true faith, and that I must not leave until I have received this blessing. When I protested that I have business obligations, he reminded me that the flesh is weak, but the spirit must be strong. 3 days later, I tried to leave this morning before dawn, but found my horse missing from the stable. When questioned, the community members claim no knowledge of the animal's whereabouts. Elder Zimmermann suggests that perhaps God has removed this temptation and that I should view this as a sign. I am beginning to feel quite uncomfortable with the situation. The entries that follow chart Hartwell's growing desperation as he realizes that his grateful hosts have become his jailers. Other journals tell similar stories. A widow named Catherine Mills, traveling to live with relatives in Ohio, wrote of being welcomed after her wagon wheel broke. A young couple, the Brennans, seeking cheap farmland, described the community's enthusiastic offers to help them settle permanently. In each case, what began as gratitude slowly transformed into growing unease, then mounting panic. The pattern was always the same. Outsiders would be welcomed with overwhelming hospitality. Any attempt to leave would be met with increasingly creative obstacles: missing horses, damaged wagon wheels, concern for the traveler's spiritual welfare, and always Elder Zimmermann's insistence that God's providence had brought them to Friedenshof for a reason that had not yet been fulfilled. Through these hidden journals, we can piece together the elaborate system Friedenshof had developed to trap and control outsiders. It was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation, wrapped in the language of religious duty and Christian love. The first stage was isolation. New arrivals would find their means of transportation mysteriously disabled or missing. Letters they attempted to send would disappear from the community's makeshift postal system. Any mention of leaving would be met with expressions of hurt and bewilderment. Surely they weren't rejecting the community's Christian hospitality. The second stage was indoctrination. Elder Zimmermann would begin holding special prayer sessions for the lost souls that God had delivered to their valley. These sessions, initially presented as optional, would gradually become mandatory. The theology preached in these meetings grew increasingly specific. Outsiders were inherently sinful. Their desire to leave was evidence of Satan's influence, and only through complete submission to the community's will could they achieve salvation. The third stage was paperwork. Documents would disappear, letters of credit would be lost, identification papers would be accidentally destroyed in convenient fires. Without these crucial documents, travelers found themselves unable to prove their identities or access their funds, even if they did manage to escape. The final stage was community complicity. Every member of Friedenshof, from the youngest child to the oldest grandmother, was taught that keeping outsiders was a holy duty. Those who expressed doubts about this practice were reminded that questioning God's will was the first step toward damnation. Catherine Mills' journal provides a chilling glimpse into how thoroughly this system could destroy a person's sense of reality. It has been 6 months since my arrival, though they insist it has been only 3 weeks. They have destroyed my calendar, claiming it was leading me into sin by causing me to focus on worldly time rather than God's eternal present. When I protest, they gather around me with such expressions of loving concern that I begin to doubt my own memory. Elder Zimmermann reminds me daily that confusion is a sign that Satan still has hold of my mind, and that only through complete surrender to their guidance can I find clarity. Perhaps the most horrifying aspect of Friedenshof's system was what happened to the children born to captive women. These children, growing up knowing no world beyond the valley, became unwitting accomplices in their mother's imprisonment. From the Journal of Margaret Foster, a young woman captured in 1894. My son asks why I cry when I look at the mountains. How can I explain that beyond those peaks lies a world he has never seen? A world where people are free to come and go as they please? He has been taught that such freedom is an illusion, that only within these valley walls can true safety be found. When I speak of cities and trains and electric lights, he looks at me with the same pitying expression the others wear. They have convinced him that these are the fantasies of a mind still corrupted by worldliness. The community had developed elaborate stories to explain the presence of these outsider women and their children. They were presented as widows who had chosen to join the community after being called by God. Their children were raised as full members, learning Pennsylvania Dutch and Amish customs as if they had been born to them. But the mothers knew the truth, and in their hidden journals they recorded it. These children became perhaps the cruelest tools of psychological torture. What mother could abandon her child, even to escape captivity? What woman could drag a 5-year-old away from the only home he had ever known, into a world that had been painted as sinful and dangerous? The community understood this bind perfectly. They encouraged the captive women to have more children, blessing each pregnancy as evidence of God's favor. With each birth, the chains of motherhood grew heavier, making escape not just physically difficult, but emotionally impossible. The journals found in 2019 represent only a fraction of the people who passed through Friedenshof during its darkest period. But the testimonies they contain paint a horrifying picture of systematic psychological abuse disguised as Christian charity. From Thomas Brennan's journal, found wrapped in oilcloth beneath the floorboards, "Today marks 1 year since Mary and I arrived seeking farmland. We are no closer to leaving than we were on that first day. They have broken us systematically like farmers break horses. First, they removed our means of escape. Then they isolated us from any source of truth beyond their own words. Now they work to convince us that our desire for freedom is evidence of our spiritual sickness. Mary no longer speaks of leaving. She spends her days in the company of the women, learning their ways, accepting their teachings. When I remind her of our plans, of the life we meant to build together, she looks at me with empty eyes and reminds me that such worldly concerns are vanity. They have convinced her that our love itself was sinful, a distraction from divine purpose. I write these words in secret, by candlelight, knowing that discovery would mean punishment. But I cannot let this evil go unrecorded. Someone must know what happened here. Someone must understand that we did not come to this place willingly, and we do not remain by choice. The psychological warfare employed by Friedenshof was sophisticated for its time. Modern experts in cult behavior would recognize the techniques: isolation from outside support systems, control of information, sleep deprivation through mandatory prayer sessions, creation of an us versus them mentality that portrayed the outside world as inherently dangerous. But perhaps most insidiously, they used the captives' own consciences against them. Any expression of anger or resentment was treated as proof of spiritual corruption. Any attempt to resist was met not with overt force, but with hurt disappointment and renewed efforts at healing. The victims were made to feel that their suffering was evidence of their own moral failings. Edgar Hartwell's final entries capture this psychological torture with heartbreaking clarity. I no longer know what is real. They have been so kind, so patient with my resistance. When I shout, they respond with gentle voices. When I curse, they pray for my soul. They have convinced me that my anger is evidence of Satan's hold on my heart, and that only through acceptance can I find peace. But late at night, when the prayers finally end and the community sleeps, I remember. I remember having a life beyond this valley. I remember plans and dreams that extended past these mountains. I remember being a man who made his own choices. In the morning, those memories will fade again under the weight of their loving concern. But tonight, I write them down. Tonight, I bear witness to what I was before they began their patient work of breaking me apart and rebuilding me in their image. Not everyone who found themselves trapped in Friedenshof accepted their fate quietly. The journals record numerous escape attempts, each more desperate than the last, and each ending in recapture and increasingly severe spiritual intervention. The community had developed an elaborate network of lookouts and informants throughout the surrounding countryside. Local farmers, sympathetic to their Amish neighbors' desire to maintain their isolation, would report any suspicious strangers to Elder Zimmermann. County officials, either bought off or genuinely believing the community's cover stories about recovering the mentally ill, would routinely return escapees to Friedenshof's care. Catherine Mills made 3 documented escape attempts. Her journal describes the first in heartbreaking detail. I waited until the new moon, when darkness would hide my movement. I had fashioned rough shoes from scraps of leather and hoarded bread for 3 days. The children were told I had taken ill and needed solitude for prayer and healing. I made it nearly 10 miles before they found me. Not the community members themselves. They are too cunning for such obvious pursuit. Instead, it was a local farmer who spotted me on the road at dawn. He approached with apparent kindness, offering food and rest. Only when I was seated in his wagon did he reveal that he was taking me back to where I belonged. Elder Zimmermann welcomed my return with tears of joy, proclaiming it a miracle that God had protected me from the dangers of the outside world. The community gathered to pray for my healing, their faces filled with such genuine love and concern that I began to doubt my own motivations. Perhaps I truly was mentally ill. Perhaps their care was exactly what I needed. The second attempt, 6 months later, ended with Mills being found unconscious from exposure, having wandered in circles for 2 days in woods that the locals navigated with ease. The third attempt isn't described in detail, only referenced obliquely in later entries as my final rebellion against God's will. Other escape attempts ended more tragically. Thomas Brennan's journal references the death of another captive during a winter escape attempt, though the details are deliberately vague, as if even writing about it might bring punishment. The community's official story was always the same. The poor soul had suffered a mental breakdown and wandered into the wilderness, a tragic reminder of what happened when the spiritually ill rejected proper care. By 1897, Friedenshof held an estimated 30 to 40 outsiders in various stages of psychological captivity. Some, like Catherine Mills, maintained enough awareness to document their situation. Others had been so thoroughly broken that they genuinely believed themselves blessed to be part of the community. A few had been born into captivity and knew no other world, but the system that had operated in perfect secrecy for 5 years was beginning to show cracks. The first crack appeared in the person of David Stoltzfus, a young Amish man who had grown up in the community but began to question its practices as he reached adulthood. Unlike the outsiders, Stoltzfus understood that the wider Amish community would be horrified by Friedenshof's activities. The isolation and theological extremism that Elder Zimmermann preached were as foreign to traditional Amish beliefs as they would be to any English congregation. Stoltzfus began secretly documenting the community's activities, keeping careful records of who was being held against their will and for how long. His notes, discovered years later in a barn wall, provide crucial external validation for the captives' journals. Elder Zimmermann preached today that God has blessed us with 37 souls to save. He spoke of each as if they were voluntary converts, but I have watched them. I have seen the desperate looks when they think no one is watching. I have heard the crying at night from the houses where the English women live with their children. This is not salvation. This is imprisonment, and I fear that God will judge us all for our silence. The second crack came from outside the community. In late 1897, a federal postal inspector named James McKenna began investigating reports of missing mail in the region. Several families had complained that letters sent to relatives traveling through Pennsylvania had never been delivered, and that return letters had never been received. McKenna's investigation led him to interview local postal workers and eventually to ask uncomfortable questions about the isolated Amish settlement in the Mountain Valley. His official report, found in federal archives a century later, noted irregular mail handling practices and suspicious attitudes toward federal oversight in the Friedenshof community. But the final crack, the one that would ultimately bring down the entire system, came from within Elder Zimmermann's own family. Rachel Zimmermann was Elder Jakob's youngest daughter, barely 16 when she witnessed something that shattered her faith in her father's holy mission. The exact nature of what she saw is lost to history. Her own account was destroyed in the fires that consumed much of Friedenshof's records. But secondary sources suggest that she discovered evidence of physical abuse, or perhaps something even darker, occurring in the community's healing sessions. Whatever Rachel witnessed, it drove her to take an unprecedented risk. In the spring of 1898, she made contact with David Stoltzfus, and together they devised a plan to expose the community's activities to outside authorities. Their method was brilliantly simple. Rachel would claim to be suffering from spiritual visions that required her to undertake a pilgrimage to other Amish communities. This would give her legitimate reason to travel beyond the valley. Once outside, she would make contact with county officials and reveal the truth about Friedenshof's captives. But their plan required perfect timing and absolute secrecy. The community had survived for 6 years by maintaining ironclad control over information. Any leak would result not just in punishment for the conspirators, but likely in the immediate elimination of evidence and witnesses. The Journal of Margaret Foster, one of the longest-held captives, captures the tension of those final weeks. Something is changing in the community. I can feel it in the way people look at each other, in the hushed conversations that stop when outsiders approach. Elder Zimmermann's sermons have become increasingly frantic, filled with warnings about enemies who seek to destroy our holy work. Yesterday, he announced that God had revealed a great trial approaching, a test of our faith that would require absolute loyalty and complete silence. He spoke of martyrdom as if it were a privilege, of sacrifice as if it were joy. I fear what is coming, but for the first time in 4 years, I also feel something I had forgotten: hope. The end, when it came, was swift and chaotic. On June 15, 1898, Rachel Zimmermann successfully left the valley under the pretense of her spiritual pilgrimage. Within 48 hours, she had reached the county seat and begun telling her story to Sheriff William Crawford. Crawford's initial reaction was skeptical. The idea that an entire Amish community was systematically kidnapping and holding outsiders seemed too outlandish to believe. But Rachel's detailed knowledge of the captives, their names, their backgrounds, the stories they had told about their lives before Friedenshof, convinced him that her claims deserved investigation. On June 20th, Crawford led a party of 12 armed men into the valley. What they found exceeded even Rachel's horrifying descriptions. 31 outsiders were being held in various states of psychological captivity. Some greeted the rescue party with tears of relief. Others, so thoroughly conditioned by years of abuse, cowered and begged not to be taken from their sanctuary. The physical evidence was equally damning. Hidden rooms in several buildings contained restraints and other equipment used to control difficult captives. A cache of destroyed personal belongings, letters, photographs, identification papers, was found buried behind Elder Zimmermann's house. Most horrifyingly, investigators discovered a small cemetery containing unmarked graves of unknown number. Elder Zimmermann himself was found in his study, dead by his own hand, surrounded by pages of rambling theological justification for what he called God's necessary work. His final written words, according to Sheriff Crawford's report, were, "Let history judge whether we served heaven or hell." The community's other leaders scattered. Some fled to distant Amish settlements, where they were quietly shunned by communities horrified by their actions. Others simply disappeared into the American wilderness, their ultimate fates unknown. The Friedenshof scandal should have been front-page news across Pennsylvania and beyond. 31 people held captive by a religious cult masquerading as a peaceful Amish community. It was the kind of story that would have captivated the nation. Instead, it was buried. The reasons were complex but sadly predictable. The county officials, who had ignored years of missing person reports, were deeply embarrassed by their failure. State authorities were concerned that publicity would damage Pennsylvania's reputation and harm its growing tourism industry. The legitimate Amish communities, horrified by the association with Friedenshof's crimes, pressured for silence to protect their own peaceful way of life. Most tragically, many of the rescued captives themselves requested anonymity. Years of psychological abuse had left them fragile and ashamed. They wanted nothing more than to disappear back into their old lives and forget that Friedenshof had ever existed. The official record states simply that an irregular religious community had been dissolved due to administrative irregularities and that several displaced persons had been relocated to appropriate accommodations. No mention was made of captivity, abuse, or murder. The rescued captives scattered to the winds. Some returned to families who had long given them up for dead. Others, too damaged by their experiences to resume their old lives, started fresh in distant cities where no one would ask uncomfortable questions about their missing years. A few were so thoroughly broken that they spent the remainder of their lives in state institutions, dismissed as mentally ill when they tried to tell their stories. Of the 31 people rescued from Friedenshof, only 3 are known to have left detailed accounts of their experiences. The journals found in 2019 represent the most complete record we have of what occurred in that remote valley during the 1890s. But what of the others? What of the men and women who lived and died in captivity before Sheriff Crawford's raid? What of the children born into that twisted world who grew up never knowing freedom? The unmarked graves found behind the settlement tell part of their story. County records suggest that at least a dozen people died at Friedenshof during its 6-year existence. The official causes of death were always natural: pneumonia, consumption, accidents. But the buried journals suggest a darker truth. Edgar Hartwell's final entry, dated just 2 weeks before his death was recorded, provides a chilling glimpse into the community's methods. "I have grown weaker these past days, though I cannot say why. My food tastes strange, and sleep brings no rest. When I complained of illness, Elder Zimmermann prescribed special prayers and herbal remedies that seem only to make me more confused and tired. I suspect they are poisoning me slowly, though I cannot prove it. My resistance has been too strong, my will too difficult to break. They speak of me now in past tense, as if I were already gone. Perhaps I am." Modern forensic techniques might have revealed the truth about those deaths, but the evidence was destroyed long ago. The buildings of Friedenshof were burned to the ground in 1899, officially to prevent the spread of disease, but more likely to eliminate any remaining evidence of the community's crimes. Those who survived Friedenshof carried its mark for the rest of their lives. Catherine Mills returned to her sister's family in Ohio, but never married, never had children, and died alone in 1934, with her experiences still largely untold. Margaret Foster attempted to resume her life in Massachusetts, but suffered what would now be recognized as severe PTSD, spending her final years in and out of treatment facilities. Thomas Brennan proved more resilient. After recovering from his ordeal, he became a traveling speaker, warning rural communities about the dangers of religious extremism. His memoir, 6 Years in Hell's Paradise, published in 1903, provided one of the few public accounts of the Friedenshof scandal. But even Brennan's book was quickly suppressed, bought up by unnamed parties and removed from circulation. The children born at Friedenshof faced perhaps the cruelest fate of all. Raised in captivity but rescued into a world they had been taught to fear, they struggled to adapt to normal society. Some were placed with Amish families who tried to give them proper homes. Others ended up in orphanages or asylums when no relatives could be found. One of these children, known only as Little Mary in the records, grew up to become a social worker in Philadelphia. In 1954, near the end of her life, she gave a sealed interview to a historian researching religious communities in Pennsylvania. Her account, opened only in 2010, provides our clearest picture of what daily life was like for the captive families. "We children knew something was wrong, even if we couldn't name it. Our mothers cried when they thought we weren't looking. They would stare at the mountains with such longing that it made our hearts ache. When we asked why we never went beyond the valley, we were told that the outside world was full of evil people who would hurt us. But children see things adults miss. We saw the locked doors at night. We saw the way our mothers flinched when certain men approached. We saw the fear behind their eyes when they spoke of God's will. I didn't understand until years later that we were prisoners. All of us. Even the Amish families who thought they were serving God. They were prisoners too, trapped by their leaders' madness, just as surely as the outsiders were trapped by bars and chains. More than a century after its dissolution, Friedenshof continues to raise troubling questions about the nature of religious authority, community complicity, and institutional failure. How did 31 people disappear without triggering a meaningful investigation? How did an entire community convince itself that kidnapping and psychological torture were acts of Christian charity? How did county officials, postal workers, and neighboring farmers all fail to recognize or report what was happening in that remote valley? The answer, unfortunately, is as relevant today as it was in 1892. Isolated communities can still operate beyond meaningful oversight. Religious authority can still be used to justify unconscionable acts, and people in positions of responsibility can still find ways to avoid seeing inconvenient truths. The journals found in 2019 forced a reckoning with this buried history. Genealogical researchers have identified descendants of some Friedenshof survivors, many of whom had family stories about relatives who had disappeared for a few years in the 1890s but had never known the full truth. DNA testing has even identified unmarked graves in the abandoned cemetery, finally giving names to some of the victims. But for every question these discoveries have answered, they have raised two more. How many other isolated communities engaged in similar practices? How many other missing persons from that era met similar fates? How many other dark chapters of American history remain buried beneath rural farmhouses, waiting for renovation work to bring them back to light? Today, the valley where Friedenshof once stood is empty wilderness. The Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Resources maintains it as part of a larger forest preserve, and hikers occasionally stumble across the stone foundations that mark where buildings once stood. Few realize they are walking through the remains of one of America's most sinister religious communities. But the legacy of Friedenshof extends far beyond that remote valley. The psychological techniques pioneered by Elder Zimmermann and his followers, isolation, information control, exploitation of spiritual authority, gradual erosion of personal identity, would be recognized by modern cult experts as sophisticated brainwashing methods. The failure of institutions to respond appropriately to the disappearances presaged similar failures in later decades, when isolated communities engaged in abuse. The cover-up that followed the scandal established a template that would be repeated whenever religious authority clashed with secular law. Most importantly, the testimonies preserved in those hidden journals serve as a reminder that evil often wears the mask of righteousness, that suffering can be inflicted in the name of salvation, and that the most dangerous tyrants are often those who genuinely believe they are doing God's work. In one of the final entries found in Catherine Mill's journal, she wrote words that echo across the centuries. They broke our bodies by keeping us prisoner. They broke our minds by calling our resistance sin. But worst of all, they tried to break our souls by convincing us that our suffering was holy, that our pain was pleasing to God, that our captivity was actually freedom. If anyone ever reads these words, remember this. No God worthy of worship would demand such sacrifice. No faith worthy of the name would require such submission. No community built on love would need to hold its members by force. Remember us not as willing converts, but as human beings who fought against darkness, even when that darkness called itself light. The contractors who found those journals in 2019 faced a choice that echoes through history. They could have quietly discarded them, avoiding the discomfort of confronting such a dark story. They could have sold them to private collectors, ensuring that the truth remained hidden from the broader public. They could have handed them over to authorities who might have found reasons to suppress them once again. Instead, they chose to make them public. They chose to honor the voices of those who had suffered in silence for over a century. They chose to ensure that the victims of Friedenshof would finally be remembered not as willing converts to a peaceful faith, but as human beings who endured unspeakable cruelty while maintaining their humanity. This choice, the choice to bear witness to uncomfortable truths, is perhaps the only redemption that can be wrung from such a dark story. The dead cannot be brought back. The suffering cannot be undone. The years stolen from those captives can never be returned. But their stories can be told. Their experiences can be acknowledged. Their pain can be validated, and their resistance can be honored. In doing so, we keep alive the most important truth of all, that no matter how thoroughly evil disguises itself as righteousness, no matter how completely darkness masquerades as light, somewhere someone is bearing witness. Somewhere someone is keeping record. Somewhere someone refuses to let the truth be buried forever. The village of Friedenshof is gone, but the voices of those who suffered there will not be silenced again. They will not let us forget. And perhaps in remembering, we honor not only their memory, but our obligation to ensure that such horrors never occur again.